In principle, in theory, what would be the possible advantages of doing that dimensionality expansion before going in the opposite direction?
Um, it's good to think about it in terms of information coming in, let's say to our eyes. We're studying a visual system, and what's going out. What's going out is actually the output of our system is fairly low dimensional. We can really describe what we do on a moment by moment basis with, just a few bits of information,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, However, the amount of information coming in through our very high dimensional sensors, our retinas are some of the best cameras on the planet, basically. This is extremely high dimensional information. As we
Mm-hmm.
walk around, we're bombarded with very high dimensional information, lots of photons in all sorts of configurations that our brains are somehow very well optimized to extract information from and distill it down to these very few bits of information that go out, um, which constitute our decisions, right? We see a familiar face, we say hi, that's the output. The computation itself has involved like a very high dimensional process.
Hmm.
Now, what's really kind of surprising is even as the data coming into our retinas is so high dimensional, it appears that the way the brain solved this problem is to make it even more high dimensional inside of the brain. So we go from something like 1 million retinal ganglion cells. I might have my numbers wrong. I know the factor of expansion. I might not know the
Hmm.
absolute numbers,
There's a
but
lot.
there's a lot. But then the factor of expansion of how many inputs come in through the retina and through the ganglion cells and through our nerve, optic nerve,
Mm-hmm.
it expands by a factor of 50 or so inside of our visual cortex.
Hmm.
So for every little single pixel, let's say, in our field of view, there's another 50 neurons kind of somehow encoding that pixel in different ways, let's say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they're not encoding a single pixel, they're
Yeah.
encoding patterns of
Yeah.
pixels.
There's more ways to encode the pixels than there are incoming pixels.
Yeah. And so that's right. Another way to say like dimensionality gets expanded
Hmm.
before ultimately it has to collapse
Right.
because our
Right.
actions ultimately are relatively low dimension.
Mm-hmm. In principle, in theory, what would be the possible advantages of doing that dimensionality expansion before going in the opposite direction? Yeah, well, I mean, in principle.
So, I mean, there is an empirical answer to this, which is that when we try to design artificial neural systems, right, artificial neural networks, this kind of expansionality is beneficial,
Mm-hmm.
and these systems work better
Mm-hmm.
the more neurons they have to
I see.
to work with.
So that's just we know that's true from that perspective. So we know it's true even if we can't really explain why.
We have a few, actually, it turns out the theory for explaining why was developed before the neural networks
Hmm.
were developed. And the neural networks were not developed necessarily with this theory in mind, but um, this theory goes back to kind of statistical learning, I believe is the name. No, I may be wrong about this. This is not some of the initial ways of thinking about it is if you have a kind of a nonlinear computation you have to do, um, what you could do is take your inputs, project them into a high dimensional space, and then do a linear computation in this space. That's much easier to do now.
Hmm.
There are actual mathematical proofs that this kind of thing works almost always. Um, some of those proofs are related to neural networks that say a neural network with an intermediate width that can go very large as infinite can do any computation
Hmm.
as opposed to a perceptron that cannot by
Mm-hmm.
itself. But when you put many of them, infinitely many, kind of in a row, it can do any computation. So those are the kinds of theories um, that talk about dimensionality expansion. In practice,
Mm-hmm.
with neural networks and artificial systems, we don't just make them high dimensional, we also make them kind of hierarchical and we make them sequential.
Yeah.
So the input keeps getting processed and processed and processed and processed.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the idea here, the simple idea here is that if you do this dimensionality expansion, it can make computations easier to perform, and then you can project them down into a lower dimensionality, and then
Yep.
execute ultimately a motor action.
Correct. Yes. That
Okay.
that is the idea that has mathematical support. Um, I would say artificial neural networks both validate that in the sense that they do expand the input into a high dimensional space, but in some ways they also invalidate that because they also require kind of many repetitions of this computation to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that as much in the human brain.